Well, welcome everyone. My name is David Chinery, and here we are again on Zoom. This is one of our Lunch in the Garden programs. We're coming to you live from Troy, New York. And this is from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County. And today we're going to talk about putting your garden to bed. And it is a beautiful day outside. It's a great day to actually be putting your garden to bed. But one of the challenges so far that we've been talking a little bit about is that we haven't had any frost yet. And it seems kind of cruel and unusual to go out there and cut down some of your plants and throw things in the compost bin when it's like 75 degrees outside. So it's kind of a strange season. And I think we were talking about that we think we are going to be setting a record for the latest frost. Which may be coming in the next few days, but we're not really sure. So it's been an odd season in that way. It's been a very rainy season. It's been fairly hot, pretty humid, and it seems like a very prolonged warm period. It doesn't really even feel like fall yet to me. So it's kind of an odd one. But let me introduce our panelists today. We're going to have a panel discussion, and we have some questions that people have posed to the panel already. So we'll talk about those. Our panelists have things they'd like to talk about. And certainly the audience here, you can type a question in the chat box, or you can unmute and ask a question or respond. We're going to try to keep most of us muted most of the time, but you can unmute and ask a question as well if you want to follow up on something. So we'll try to use all of our different systems here. And my co-host here is Marcy Vanaka. She's going to be trying to run things and keep an eye on everything. So hello to Marcy. And we have Pat Mulligan, a master gardener. We have Michelle Badger, a master gardener. Barbara Newfer, a master gardener. And Julie Miller, who's on the phone from a car in Georgia. She's a master food preserver, I believe. And she's going to answer our food questions. So this is going to be kind of fun. I feel like I'm doing a radio show, TV show kind of thing here, because it's a little more live and interactive than we normally do. So I do appreciate everybody tuning in today and seeing how this goes. So let's start off with a couple questions that we've gotten beforehand. And the first one that I got, I got this question this morning, and I thought it was an interesting one. The person emailed me and said, I started rhubarb from seed this year, and the rhubarb has grown very well, but they want to know how they should protect it for the winter. So that's a good question. Any panelists want to tackle that one? Newly planted rhubarb.
I never tried it. I have no idea.
Well, how big are the plants at this point?
Well, we don't know that any of that stuff. I told you everything we know.
We don't have an interactive.
No. So I would say that probably you're going to be fine because rhubarb is pretty hardy stuff. As long as the soil is well drained, you'll probably be fine. And what I would do is I would wait until the ground freezes, and then I might mulch it a little bit and put an inch or two of chopped maybe leaves on the top, or maybe some straw, just to keep the ground cool and keep it from freezing and thawing. That's what you really don't want to have happen for anything really in your garden, is freezing and thawing all winter. So I would say wait until the ground freezes. I don't know when that's going to be, a while from now, and then I'd mulch it. So that was an interesting question. Then we had another question about forsythia. The writer said that they had some wild forsythia, and they wanted to know if they should prune it now. They knew that they would lose a lot of the flowers off of it, and I don't know that they were that concerned about it. So what do we think about pruning forsythia at this point?
I don't think there's any danger in pruning it. You will lose the blossoms for next spring, but if this is the best time for you to prune it, then prune away. Pat?
I would agree, because forsythia is going to grow regardless of when you prune it. And the only difference would be whether you lose the flowers or not. But if it's really unsightly, I'd say prune it now.
I would be careful about how far down, because the tendency sometimes is to cut the forsythia down to the ground. I would leave like a foot so you have some buds in order to have some new growth. Just based on what I've seen people do when they have to prune it now.
Yeah, I think it's probably okay to prune. I agree with Michelle. I wouldn't want to prune it all the way to the ground maybe, but I think you could prune it fairly severely if you wanted to. And another part of the question talked about, well, how should I prune it? And I think you can prune it severely. I think you could shape it. I think you could kind of do anything you wanted to it. As long as you know you're not going to have as many flowers and you're okay with that. But if it's like my neighborhood, everybody has forsythia, so I can enjoy my neighbor's forsythia, even if mine isn't flowering, because there's a lot of it, and there's probably no shortage of forsythia in this area in the spring.
And also you could, semi-prune it, and then in the spring when the buds come out and you see where the leaves are, you could prune it again.
That's true too. Yeah, you could shape it a little bit more. So
Actually, the best time is like after the flower bloom, and then you could take it fairly far down to the ground because you will get a significant amount of new growth that potentially could have blossoms.
right.
That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, forsythia is one of the most forgiving plants. So it's not like a hybrid tea rose where you want to follow certain steps. You want to make sure that, you do that right with a rose or something like that. Forsythia, you have a lot of leeway and you can make a lot of mistakes and you'll come out just fine. Okay. Then I have two other questions on my list. One of them was about Japanese knotweed. Now, Japanese knotweed is a terrible, terrible weed that we have in this part of the world. And this person was cutting some of it down, and they wanted to know if they could send the dead stems off to the city compost pile. Now, I know with Japanese knotweed, you have to be very careful. You don't want to send anything that's potentially alive, like the crowns or the roots, anywhere. You don't want to send that to a compost pile. The state of New Hampshire said it is okay to compost dead stems, but I would be very, very careful about that if I was going to do that. So does anybody have any other thoughts on Japanese knotweed?
It's very hard to get rid of.
Yes. You really don't want it, and you really want to be careful if you have it. And if you have it, you really want to try to get rid of it before it gets to be a huge problem. So I would say to that writer that, be very, very careful about that.
And I definitely wouldn't spray any kind of pesticide on it because chances are it's next to water and you don't want to get, or not pesticide, herbicide, because you don't want to get the herbicides in the water. And the best thing to do is to dig out the root and let it die.
Yeah, there's procedures for getting rid of it, and different agencies have different procedures, but it is kind of complicated. So
I can share what we've done in Warrensburg in our parks. We've had it inoculated, the stems inoculated right when the flowers start to bloom. And in previous years, we tried to just cut it back and did the classic mistake. We cut it and then we had it taken away to our town landfill. And what we got was a forest of Japanese knotweed growing there.
yeah.
So we ended up having a certified, herbicide, inoculator come and our park is right along the Screw River. So this systemic really was just local for those knotweed. And so it depends on the time of the year. That's the best time when all of the energy is going into the root system. But I would definitely recommend that because it was very effective. And I would say it got 95% of our knotweed down and out. And the 5% that came back in 2 years, we had it re-inoculated, and now it's totally gone. So I think that was the best method of eliminating it.
That's great. Thank you, Teresa. That was a great follow-up. I appreciate that. So, and I'm so glad that somebody actually went out and got rid of some of it. So that's a success story right there. Super. Kudos to you and the people involved in that one. Okay, I've got another one here, and the question was very basic. It talked about cutting back your perennial garden. And this is something that the master gardeners have been debating and thinking about. It's kind of the time of the year where you want to get rid of, or you maybe want to cut down your perennial garden, take all the stuff off to the compost pile. That's how a lot of us have done things for a lot of years, but there's some other new thinking about that. So panelists, you want to talk about the perennial garden and cleaning that up?
I think we should let Michelle go first because she had some really good ideas.
Okay. I'm judicious in what I cut back and when I cut it back. I have different gardens at different locations, as many people do. And there's like one strip between the driveways where sometimes I collect the seed heads that I pass on to friends, or I plant them in the ground so I have more plants. This year, it seems like the birds got a lot of the seeds, which is good. So I'm probably going to mow that one down, and it's basically Echinacea, some Artemisia, milkweed, hosta, coneflowers of other sorts, and some asters, and that pretty much gets cut down. It gets a lot of abuse during the winter because it's between the two driveways. However, the milkweed, I'm careful with the seed pods because I'll use them for decorations and things of that nature. And you definitely don't want the seeds flying all over the place, because you'll have milkweed all over the place. In the backyard, where I've got a lot of other perennials like daylilies and coreopsis and heliopsis, I let those go down until they're pretty much dried out. And then I start pulling them out after the first frost, or pulling the leaves off or cutting the leaves off judiciously. And with the heliopsis, I leave a certain proportion of the plant, because a lot of these plants, you can't tell the difference of what they look like in the spring from a weed. And after many years of pulling perennials in the spring, thinking it was a weed, and then finding I lost the plant, I am very, very careful where I leave a little bit of the plant and I mark it. I don't cut it all the way to the ground. Also, with some of the stem plants, like the heliopsis and some of the black-eyed Susans and some of the daylilies, you want to leave some of those stems. You have friendly insects, like some of the bees and others, that they want a place to overwinter. And that provides a little hiding spot for them to overwinter. Also, I wait until after frost and after I've planted bulbs to mulch. And it's not a heavy mulch that I might do in the spring or during the summer. It's just a very light mulch. And to make sure that if I have any tender perennials, like some of the asters, or if I've planted some late blooming plants or something late in the season, or chrysanthemums that I've planted that I've had out front, I want to cover those so that they have a chance of coming back, because sometimes they will freeze dry during the winter, where they might not get enough moisture or they dry out. So I'm careful with those. But again, I would advise, if you've got some plants that you don't know what they look like in the spring, to mark them, like with a popsicle stick or with the name written on it in the location, so you know not to pull it out in the spring. And that is if you are cutting things down to the ground. Some of the other things like clematis, a lot of people will cut them back now, and I would advise to know what kind of clematis you have. If it's a spring bloomer, don't touch it, leave it alone, wait till February, see where the buds are coming out on the vine. A lot of them will bloom on old wood as well as new growth. And those you really don't want to prune until you see where the buds are coming from, because the bud will come off of a woody section fairly high up and it will send out new shoots. There are some late summer bloomers. I have a Rogushi, and that one gets pruned down to about, maybe a foot, 10 inches, because it sends up new growth from the ground. And basically it's already started to dry out. So you could tell that the stems are weakening. The Giacomani, again, those are early spring bloomers. They bloom from, those are the purple ones. They bloom from the old growth. Some of the others, like if you happen to have a sweet autumn clematis, those, after they've finished blooming, which would be about now, you would want to prune those down to about 2 feet. So you get a head start to keep them in check, because they're late summer blooming. They'll bloom on new growth. And let me see what else. And if you've got the summer flowering that bloom only on the new growth, I would just, again, be very judicious. Look at where the buds are. We've had an unusual fall, so some of the plants may have already started sending up buds again. So I would be careful. I will have to go back and prune my lilac because I've had another bloom, the second bloom. This is the first that's ever happened. So you may have the same thing where you want to take down the seed heads from the flowers, or the flower heads down. And that's pretty much it. And I wouldn't mulch until I've planted the bulbs. Otherwise you're mixing up the soil and the mulch. And if you're planting bulbs, really tamp down the soil so that squirrels and other rodents don't look for the newly dug up soil that's easy to dig into. So if I plant something, I sort of stomp it down and then I'll put mulch down on top of it. It's also a good time to put down blood meal. A lot of people use bone meal for the bulbs, but I have tended not to do that because of the chips love bone meal. So if you use the blood meal, that sort of deters them. And also with some of the bulbs, I will coat them with Bonamie. It doesn't have any bleach or anything else. I wouldn't use any of the other cleansers, but that one is, pretty gritty and rather stable. And that deters them. Also, if you put out any bulbs like dahlias or amaryllis, I would bring them in and clean them off, dry them out. And we can talk more about dahlias later, but that's basically, the perennials. The idea is be judicious. You don't have to cut everything down to the ground. I've heard, people just taking a lawnmower and going through their perennial beds, but I've left some things up like Russian sage where I don't cut it down because it adds winter interest. And then in the spring, I can tell where the new growth is coming and then I cut it. So you have something that's a little bit more interesting, and then you have other things that are pretty much taken care of. Like anything that has like just a green leafy coming out of the ground, that pretty much can go for the winter. I don't know, Patricia, do you have other ideas?
I think that pretty much covers it. This year, I have taken a heavy hand to my main perennial garden because we had to cut down 2 trees that were dying at either end of the garden. And in order to do that, I had to dig up lots and lots of perennials and pot them up to save them from getting trampled. And then I started looking at the garden and I said, golly, it's really time. I've got to do a lot of work anyway. So I have been pulling out things that have spread way more than I wanted. And I've trying to thin out the garden so that you can actually see individual plants rather than these huge masses of things. So it's been an interesting 3 months for me digging stuff up starting in July. But and I think that's important, is to really look at your garden. And maybe this is a good time to do it because you still know what plants are, because they still have their leaves and some of them still have the flowers. And you can decide, do I want, you know, huge masses of phlox or whatever you happen to have. So I think that's a good thing to do at this time of the year.
Yeah, it's a good time to do some renovation. I think now is the time to move peonies. If anybody wants to move a peony plant, the fall is the time to do that. And Barbara, do you have anything you can add to us?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, usually there are 3 plants that I definitely make sure I cut back: my peonies, because they tend to sometimes carry disease, phlox plants for the same reason, and also bee balm. And apparently some irises, it's the same issue. Some of the insects can overwinter that you don't necessarily want on some of your irises. So those 4, I would say, in particular. Also, a trick I have is, instead of using little hand clippers, because over the years my hands have gotten very cranky, I use a manual hedge trimmer. The Fiskars hedge trimmer works great for taking down peonies and large clumps of perennials.
I actually use a battery operated hedge trimmer to do the same thing, because I have way too many gardens at this point for my hands, my back, and so forth.
Right.
And that also works well. You just have to be careful if you're doing, like peonies, I often have a wire frame to keep them from sprawling. You have to make sure you take the wire frame off first.
So true. And
Yeah.
be careful with hoses and things of that nature. I clipped through a hose that was behind a peony bush and didn't realize, and just went through it with the big hedge clippers, and had to do some repairs there. The other thing I would mention is Rose of Sharon. A lot of people have Rose of Sharon plants, and maybe they're not aware that they could be trimmed. And since the Rose of Sharon basically finished blooming a couple weeks ago, I've been cutting back all of the seed pods. And it's not a complete trim back. I've made my Rose of Sharon plant into a topiary with a single stem. So I do a hard prune during the middle of winter, where I might take it back to maybe just like three little branches about 6 inches long, and then it blooms out from there. But right now I've just taken down all the seed pods. Otherwise you have Rose of Sharon plants all over the place. So that would be a suggestion. And they can become quite unmanageable as they do get 10 to 12 feet tall. And again, they're a very forgiving plant. You could practically cut them down to the ground and they'll come back. You might lose the bloom, but if you want to shape the plant, now's a good time to start, just to see. And then once the leaves are down, you can shape it further or prune it harder. And because it's such a late bloomer and it blooms only on the new growth, you're able to do that. Just be sure to leave some nodes or places where the buds can come out. And you can see these where there's a break in the bark or in the stem. And there's usually a bud already starting there, and you don't want to leave the plant without anything.
And I would just warn that, watch the height you trim them to, because I had trimmed mine one year to like 3.5, 4 feet, and it was perfect deer buffet height. So you want to leave them, if you have some height, you want to leave it. And also with boxwoods, I've made the mistake of pruning them too late. So they don't really take to pruning at this time. So wait until the spring.
Yeah, you don't want to prune boxwood at this point. That's a really good point. There's a couple comments in the chat box. One of them says, "What do you mean by mowing them down?" And I don't know, that might be, did I say that?
No, that was when that came up when Michelle was talking about the plants near her driveway, I believe, but I didn't want to interrupt her.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we're just talking about cutting down everything. I mean, I literally do use my mower sometimes, believe it or not. Somebody will be horrified by that. But on things like a bunch of daylilies, you can mow those down with a lawnmower, and it is a lot faster than a lot of other work. One point in the chat I want to just make sure we get to is it says, we are planning to plant garlic. When should that go in?
Actually, now would be a good time.
Yeah,
We did a demonstration garden a couple years ago where we planted garlic and alliums, and garlic is in the allium family. So you could find a spot, make sure you mark it, and plant it.
yeah.
And you could even plant it with some other allium bulbs just to have some flowering beauty before the plants come out.
Be sure they're hard neck garlic, and you want to put them 4 to 6 inches down.
And you want good drainage, right?
Right. And also protect them from rabbits. We had one episode where, well, it was in my plot where we were digging it out and we found a rabbit's nest under everything. The garlic was fine. They didn't eat the garlic, but apparently they thought it was a very safe place. And we're digging and the ground starts moving, and it was a whole bunch of little baby bunnies. So I would be careful when you're digging the garlic.
Okay, so yeah, garlic, plant that this afternoon. This is a good time to plant garlic. And we've had this gift of all this warm weather, so we've gotten actually more time than some years when it gets colder out faster. So we have some grace period there. We do have a question about pruning hydrangeas. When do you prune hydrangeas, and does it depend on what kind you have? Oy, now that's a big question.
It does.
Yes, it does.
I just happened to look some things up, and technically you don't have to prune hydrangeas, but there are 2 types. There's the Macrophylla quercifolia. Again, it's Hydrangea Macrophylla and Hydrangea quercifolia, which are the common hydrangea and then the oak leaf hydrangea. And those, you really don't have to prune too much, but if they get too big or tall, you can do so. You can deadhead them, but again, you don't want to deadhead them below the last bud. There are PGs and Annabelles, and they bloom only on the new growth. And these are the Hydrangea paniculata and Hydrangea arborescens. And those get pruned fall into winter. And if someone has more experience with them, please jump in.
Yeah, I think like the Annabelle, you can prune that in the spring, and then get a whole new flush of growth. And like the Macrophylla, I wouldn't prune that until you see what kind of buds you get in the spring coming out of it. What do you think, Barbara?
I absolutely agree. Probably the most important thing with your hydrangeas during the growing season is to be sure they get enough water.
Yeah, well,
You
that
don't want them
wasn't
to
probably,
dry out.
that wasn't a big deal this year, but some years they certainly do like water, right? So you really got to know what hydrangea you have and then be cautious about that. And this time of the year, I don't know if it's a great time of the year to prune really any hydrangea particularly. I would put all that off until next year and then be careful about what type you have. We do have another question. I have 3 new asparagus plants, and it's got the fern on it, the leafy part of the asparagus. Do I trim that now or only at the time to eat? Now, I think Barbara grows asparagus.
I do not.
Oh, you do not?
I tried it once and didn't work out. I buy asparagus.
I would leave the green on there until it turns brown. And that will happen with the frost. And then you can trim that off and cut it down and get rid of that. And then in the spring, it's going to send up the spears. And that's when you want to harvest it. But if it's brand new, I think you do not harvest it the first year. So you got to watch for that. But you can get rid of the ferny part or the leafy part in the later part of the fall when it dies back. Let's see. I am considering planting ornamental grass next year for privacy. What happens over the winter with that? Do you trim it to the ground or what? Well, there's different theories about ornamental grasses, right?
Yeah,
What do our panelists think about that?
I just removed 2 things of Miscanthus that were in the big garden I was talking about earlier. And the other ones, I mow down, or I use my battery operated hedge trimmers and cut them down in the fall. A lot of people like to look at them because they're a winter interest, but my experience has been that if you leave the seed pods on it, you're going to have more ornamental grass than you want.
What I do is I bundle them in twine so that when they reach the point where they're getting sort of nasty, if I get a nice day in January or February, then I'll go down and cut them down, because I find the birds like to sit on them, and I enjoy the height of them catching the snow. But some of them I have along a fence, and when they start to come down, I will cut them as they're naturally coming down. But again, you can tie them onto the fence, and especially zebra grass. I have not had an issue with them sending out seedlings.
Yeah, I think Miscanthus is the most durable of them. If you want to leave a grass up, it's probably Miscanthus. A lot of the other ones kind of get flattened down anyway, so I kind of trim those back in the fall. Miscanthus is on the invasive plant list in New York State, so do be aware of that. I haven't had it being invasive in my garden, but it is invasive in some parts of New York State, so be careful with Miscanthus. It's not easy to say. Some of the other ones like Panicum, you could leave that or cut it down. Doesn't really matter. And what you do want to do is cut it down in the spring, though, before it starts to grow. I've seen people not cut it down in the spring, and then the new growth starts to come up through the dead foliage, and that makes a really big mess. So cut it down, by sometime in April at the latest, probably. Okay. It is my understanding that new thinking about fall cleanup is not cleaning everything up, not cleaning everything out to let pests, birds, etc. places overwinter, and to do the big cleanup in the spring. Is that correct? Yes, that's the kind of different thinking. I was trained as a horticulturist, and you kind of cleaned everything up in the fall. And now there's other thought that we should leave some of these things, I think as Michelle said, that might be places that insects overwinter or shelter, maybe food for the birds, a little more environmentally friendly. But I think we all have to balance that with what Barbara said, that there's some things that have a lot of diseases on them. And maybe we should be getting rid of those, like the phlox that's full of disease, or the monarda that's full of disease, or the peony. So it's become one of those issues that it's not black or white anymore. And you can look at it in different ways. So there's no real right or wrong answer there. And now we have to think about it a little bit more than we used to.
And I think one thing we didn't mention was cleaning out your vegetable garden. You want to be sure you absolutely get all your vegetable plants, either the tomatoes that may be diseased. You really want to clean up your vegetable garden as best you can.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, here's a great question. I have 3-year-old mums. They're getting too big for the area. How and when can I divide them? Ooh, panelists, I don't grow mums. Hopefully one of you guys does.
I think you can divide them now. I've had good luck with doing that, especially this year since it's been so warm. That was one of the things that I actually had to remove, because some of my mums had grown, 6 feet around, which was sort of excessive. And but I've had good luck. I think the earlier in the fall you divide them, the better. But I think because it's been so warm and that they will still continue growing, that you could do it now if you need to.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you, Pat. Let's see. I have an invasion of ground ivy this year. Can anything be done at this time of year? Wow. Well, do you want the lawn care answer for that? I'm not sure anybody here does. But as far as if ground ivy was in your lawn and you were not adverse to chemicals, this would be the time to use the herbicide on it because it really works very well at this time of the year. And there's selective herbicides that will kill just the ground ivy and leave the grass alone. So if you were going to do any kind of herbicide treatment to a lawn, this is the time to do it. A lot of the herbicide treatment that's done to lawns in other parts of the year does not work very well. And it's almost a waste of time and money and chemicals, really, in my opinion. So if that's the case, that would be the time to do ground ivy, or now would be the time to do ground ivy. Other than that, what can we do about ground ivy? Just really pull it out, I suppose. I don't know if anybody has any other suggestions about ground ivy. Marcy, did you have a food question?
I do. I have a few questions, food questions. I was just waiting for you to catch up.
Yeah, you may ask away.
I also think that we might have skipped one in the beginning of the chat. It says, when you dig up elephant ears, should you cut off the roots on the bulb? Did I miss that one?
Oh, I don't see that in my chat.
Yeah, when you dig up elephant ears, should you cut off all the roots on the bulb?
Okay, who grows elephant ears?
Nope, I don't.
Uh-oh. I know people do dig those up and they store them over the winter. And I believe if you're going to dig that up and dry it out, it would be okay to cut the roots off. I think some people overwinter that just in a pot though, and you kind of let it just dry out. That's not something I've done, so that's not probably a great answer. Let's go to a food question.
Okay, so I got some food questions. What are some of the best ways to preserve the greens like nutritious kale, collards, and herbs like parsley, oregano, lovage, celery?
Is Julie there?
I am here, and that's a great question because the kale and collards. I'm sorry about the video, but we're driving. What I do with my kale and collards, at this time of year, we need to use them up. I bring them inside, I take them off the rib, and I cut them up in small pieces, and I cook it with a little salted water. And I've provided some herb salt recipes for you that you can share with others, but I may put a little of that in, cook it till it's done, cool them down, and I pack them flat in quart freezer bags and put them in the freezer. And in the winter, when I want to make soups or stews, I can just put that whole packet in. And it's a great way to use up a lot of those wonderful greens. And as far as those herbs go, now's a good time because we haven't had a frost. You might still have some basil, but I make a lot of herb salts, and I take those herbs and oregano, parsley, celery leaves, rosemary and sage I use sparingly because they are strong. And I puree them, chop them in the food processor with salt, and I make great herb salts. If you want to just dry them, there's ways to dry them, as in you can put them in little paper bags and hang them upside down in your kitchen or a warm, dry area. And there's a couple of really good websites that we as food preservers refer people to if you have questions about preserving, freezing, and drying. And that's the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And I think there's links to it through Cornell, your website. So
I can put it in the chat. I can put it in the chat box, Julie.
Yeah, and that sheet that I sent over has all the recipes for making basil, herb salt, and freezing your greens. I sent it to Dave. Maybe you can post that later in the follow-up for people to use.
Here's another food question. What is an easy way to preserve tomatoes? Canning is wonderful, but are there other ways?
Well, freezing is a great way to preserve tomatoes. Just one backpedal a little bit to if you do decide to can your tomatoes, there's very specific guidelines that have changed over the years. So if you've been canning for 20 or 40 years, it's been all the recommendations have changed, and that site that I referred to will give you the new methods. And you never want to preserve tomatoes that are on frost-killed vines. Freezing, yes, but not for canning. So if you don't want to can them, freezing, you can just pop them in freezer bags and use them because they're going to get soft anyway, and use them in your different cooking processes for sauces. If you want to take the skins off, there's ways to do that. Then chop them up and put them in freezer bags. But you definitely want to use freezer grade bags and get all that air out and label them clearly and date them. And you can store them flat in your freezer and use them all through the winter. Yeah, Marcy, that site has all those answers for them too, if you want to post that.
Okay, perfect. I'll put that in the chat in just a few minutes.
Okay.
Pat, this is kind of a comment about you, and it says this person believes that you freeze your herbs in ice cube trays. Do you want to talk about that?
I have done that, but I've had better luck with preserving them by drying them in the microwave. I have made the ice cubes before with different herbs, and I've done it. Also, I've preserved them in vinegar to make a balsam flavored vinegar or different vinegars, mint vinegars, and so forth.
Oh, interesting. David, that looks like all the questions that I have, but I'd also like to let people know on here that Cooperative Extension is having a seasonal stew, soups, and sweets Zooms. It's going to be 3 evenings. I should tell you the dates. November 10, November 17, and December 1st. So the first one's November 10th, and it'll be talking about stews.
I got it, Sean.
So we'll be working with a couple people to so I'll be sending out information about that one, and it'll be on our website as well. And I think that's all I have, David.
I think the batteries are okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds good, Marcy. I'm going to go back, and we've got a couple more questions left in the chat that I can see. This says, I noticed mushroom type activity on my lilac branches. Is this a problem?
Yes.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good.
Doesn't sound good at all.
I have seen, and I don't know if this is what the writer is referring to, but on a very old lilac stem, sometimes you'll get sort of it almost looks like a flat sort of whitish or grayish growth projecting out. It's like a shelf fungus on that. And that's not so good. So I would probably prune that out. I think anything that looks like a mushroom type thing on a woody plant is tending to indicate decay, and that probably should be pruned out. So if possible, prune that out, and hopefully you'll have more of the plant left and the plant will be fine. Another question, to go back to the ornamental grasses, if the grass gets overgrown and it might start dying in the center, how can you divide it? This is the famous donut effect of many perennials and ornamental grasses. Maybe Barbara, do you want to tackle that one?
I have a big, strong husband, but it's pretty difficult to divide those. There's a special shovel that's, I can't think of the name of it, that's really sharp, an adze. You know what adze, David? A-D-Z. Yeah. So something like that, the bigger grasses are really difficult to dig out. So you might want to wait till the soil is wet. It's harder when it's dry. And it'd probably be easiest to deal with when the grass has been either cut down or first thing in the spring when you're not dealing with trying to fight all the branches of the grass. But it's a job.
Yeah, you can, there is a theory that you can take a piece from the outside dig a hole in the center where the grass has died out and plop that piece in the middle and fill in the donut hole. So some people do that. I've had ornamental grasses that did that and they get the donut hole, and I just dig a lot of them up and kind of rearrange them. And I think it's best to do that in the spring, because a lot of these ornamental grasses are what we call C4 plants or C4 grasses. That has to do with how they do photosynthesis, but they really like warm weather and they only grow in warm soil. So messing with ornamental grasses this time of the year is probably not going to be good for them. I would do it in the spring because they'll like that warm weather better. Should you put compost manure on your vegetable garden in the spring or fall? What do you guys think?
I think fall, after you've cleaned out the garden, I would, test the soil for pH. And depending on what you're growing, you might want to amend it now.
Test the manure for pH too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if it's well rotted, you could put it on a garden, either in the spring or the fall. But make sure it says, Marie says that it's composted, so that's okay. And I think either spring or the fall would be okay. It probably will lose some of its nutrient value over the winter. So if I was going to put it on in the fall, I might even turn it into the soil to maybe help hold some of the nutrients. And if you had extra, you could put it on your compost pile, because that'll make your compost pile compost faster. Composted manure is like a gift from the gods, right? That's a good thing.
And some people even take their unfinished compost and they'll layer it into their vegetable garden, and it will finish composting over the winter.
Right, you could do that. Yeah, that would be fine to do in the winter as well. What can you do with a 9 bark that has fungus? Can you cut them down? What do you guys think?
Definitely prune out any of the fungus and do not put it in your compost pile. Dispose of it either in the garbage or some other way, but do not compost it so you don't spread it.
And cut the branch all the way down to the base of the plant.
Yeah, you could cut some of that out. I think 9 bark is pretty resilient, so I would cut out the bad parts and send it off to the landfill. Let's see, blueberry. Last year I didn't put pine needles around them in the fall, and my 3 bushes only produced 6 cups versus 10 cups I got the prior year. Was it not putting pine needles on them or just the seasonal weather? Well, I think blueberries like acidic soil, right? They like a low pH. So as long as the plant looks dark green and is growing well, that would mean your pH is okay. And maybe, I don't think that the pine needles probably made so much difference. I would think that we had a lot of rain this year, and when it rains, the pollinators don't work very well. And when the pollinators don't work well on blueberry plants, you're not going to get a lot of fruit. So I would almost tend to blame the weather and maybe poor pollination for poor fruit set. You panelists, can you think of anything else?
I would check to make sure that the plant isn't getting shaded too, because with all of the rain, if it's in an area that it might have gotten more shade than normal, so you might have to prune back some branches. My blueberries didn't bloom at all this past year. Last year I had a bumper crop. This year, nothing. I didn't even see very many flowers on it. And with the flowers, there were no berries. So I was assuming it was getting too much shade at this point, and with all the rain, the whole bush was like off cycle.
I think so. Yeah, we had lots of blossoms, but no blueberries because it was raining when the pollinators should have been busy.
Yeah, and we have up in the Adirondacks, we have a cabin, and the island is usually loaded with blueberries, and this year, nothing. So Mother Nature even didn't produce the blueberries.
Yeah.
Well, that's another thing we're having a shortage of, I guess.
Right, along with toilet paper and
Okay, there's a couple more here, and thank you everybody for your questions. Should I fertilize perennials? If so, with what? What do you guys do for fertilizing your perennial gardens?
I use either compost or 5-10-5,
And do you do that in the spring, Pat?
usually in the spring, yes.
Okay, so
I actually have had fairly good luck when you could get big bags of 5-10-5, and I'm not sure you can do that anymore. But I used to sprinkle them on what I hoped was the last snow of the winter. And I would just sprinkle it on so I could tell where it went on the white snow. And then it would melt in and fertilize the plants. But
That's,
now it's hard to find new 5-10-5 in New York State.
that's absolutely the perfect time to do it. I use the garden tone or flower tone because it's organic fertilizer. And a trick I learned from the Daylily Society was to use alfalfa pellets on your daylilies early in the spring. You can buy them at Agway. They're for horses, and they'll give you a funny look if you say you're using it for your daylilies. But it's a slow release organic fertilizer. It's relatively inexpensive. And there are some theories that the alfalfa may actually help with the jumping worms. I know they're looking into alfalfa and gluten, so maybe it'll serve a dual purpose.
Ooh.
yeah, the alfalfa has saponin in it. And saponin is a soapy material, and that's what's the enemy of the jumping worm. So yes, the alfalfa is on the research list for maybe controlling the jumping worms. And you heard it here first, right? So yeah, I would fertilize in the late winter, early spring. I think that's the timing, and I think there's lots of different ways to do it. So anything from 5-10-5 to alfalfa pellets. Is it still okay to prune pine trees this month? You guys have any thoughts on that?
What was the question again?
Is it still okay to prune pine trees this month?
I think it depends on the pine tree. There's been a significant needle drop with a lot of the white pines. I'm still raking. I have only 2 white pines in front, and the lawn had like maybe 4 inches of needles. I think if you wait a little bit later until it's colder, and you could do some pruning if you're taking whole branches so you don't get the sap run. Pine trees, unless you're shaping, if you're taking branches down, you want to do it when the trees are dormant so the sap doesn't run and insects won't get in it. So I find if I'm wanting branches for wreaths and things of that nature, I'll go through and judiciously trim my evergreens, whether it be the arborvitae or the white pine or whatever else I have. And I've not had any problems, but again, it depends on whether you're taking a whole branch or whether you're pruning it for shape and growth. Because wherever you're pruning it, you know, chances are it may bud out at that location. In numerous places, so it might get a little bushier there.
Yeah, I would say, I would agree with Michelle. It's probably not the best time to prune something like that. And one of the reasons I always think of is we used to have a plant pathologist at Cornell named Dr. Hudler. And he was a brilliant pathologist, and he would talk about a lot of the decay fungi that infect trees move around in the fall. So if you make a wound on a tree in the fall, it's a great time of the year for that fungus to invade that pruning cut and get into a tree. So pruning this time of the year, you know, it may not be the best thing for the health of the tree in the long term, because we do have a lot of decay fungi out blowing in the wind at this point. So I would probably wait until the winter and do that when a lot of other stuff is dormant. We have one last question here. It says, are the alfalfa pellets good for any perennial garden? Do you want to follow up on that one, Barbara?
Yeah, I would assume they are. It's a slow release organic fertilizer. I have used it strictly on my daylilies because I have probably 100 daylilies and I can kill a 50-pound bag pretty easily, but 50 pounds is quite a bit. So I would absolutely think it'd be fine on all your perennials. You just have to watch when you put them down, they sort of swell with water. So you don't want to have them right on the crown of your plant. You want to be sure you put it around the crown of your plant. And then I usually put at that point my cedar bark mulch on. So I do that in the spring.
Okay, that sounds good. So those are all the questions we have. If anybody has another question, type it in the chat box now. I think I would like to just kind of finish up with a few comments about some of our favorite pests that we didn't really talk about, and that would be deer, because I know some of our panelists deal with deer, and just as a kind of a number of jobs that you could do at this point, I'm going to be out putting some deer netting out on some of my evergreen plants, and I have some barriers I put around some of my plants, and I'm going to maybe be doing those kind of things. Some people like to use Milorganite on the ground. I've heard different stories about Milorganite being hard to find. I don't know if that's really true. But do any of the panelists have any suggestions about deer?
Well, I know at this time of year, or certainly before the ground freezes, we go around with fence post, the metal fence posts, and put them around gardens in the back of the house and the front of the house, and then individual shrubs. And then we fence it with, we use plastic fencing that's squares that are about 2 inches into, square. And it keeps the deer out as long as they're about 3 or 4 feet away from the leaves. I also have used Milorganite. I've used, during the rest of the growing season, I used Plant Skid, which is a blood product. And you add water to it and spray that on the plants. And that seems to last 4 to 6 weeks, which is longer than a lot of the other deer repellents. But I can look out almost any day and see 3 or 4 deer out on the lawn in the middle of the day. And so I have to be very vigilant. Otherwise I'd have no plants.
Yeah, and I know Barbara has a big deer fence.
I have an 8-foot fence around my most of my property, but I do have plants outside the fence. And last year they decided to devour my 35-year-old rhododendrons to create a little den for themselves. And I have been spraying fairly successfully, but I know once we go away for 2 or 3 weeks in the winter, they will come in. And I intend to put up some fencing just as Pat described, get some posts, get any kind of fencing, and just try to keep them out, because the spray alone does not work. But I have found a trick at the base of my rose plants. I've been planting chives and any sort of alliums, and they tend not to like that smell.
Yeah,
Seems to be working.
They also don't like the smell of strongly scented herbs. So if you don't mind mixing herbs in with perennials, that's another way to do it.
But remember the height thing too, because at
Right.
3 or 4 feet, that's what they did to my Rosa Sharon. I cut it down and it was perfect buffet. So I had to let it regrow, and remember not to cut it to buffet height.
Right. Our vegetable garden, which is raised beds, has a 7-foot fence around it. And only once have the deer jumped in. Only once. In 15 years, we saw deer tracks, and they must have freaked out because it's a small area. And that was the only time. I don't know if they passed the word or what.
But the bears do come in. They climb the 8-foot fence and come in.
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do.
We do.
And I like the comment about we got to put the posts in now, because if you wait too long, the ground will freeze and then you can't put your posts in, right? So,
Correct.
So that's good. So it says a neighbor uses a dog kennel garden to keep the deer out. All dogs do help. Some dogs do. Some dogs like to make friends with the deer, I know. So, well, we've done about an hour. We certainly welcome everybody that's been here and say thank you to everybody that's been here. I want to say thank you to our panel. So thank you, panel, for being here today. I guess if no one else has any other questions, we can wrap up. We will be doing hopefully some more of these lunch in the garden programs in the coming winter time. So stay tuned for more of these kind of things. And we do appreciate everybody being here, and go out and get to work. Have a good day. Bye-bye.